the 750 Motor Club Bikesports Championship, which gets underway with Charles Hall slotting then into the lead ahead of Mattel. But it was side by side behind for third, and Leon Morell's gone round the outside of Joe Locke to grab third position as they go up towards the banking for the first time. Morell then in that standard engined car on this first lap, Johnny Palmer, pushing on and gaining a place.
Nice little tussle in the lower order between a couple of the Radical PR6s. You can pick those out from the SR3s because the drivers sit right in the middle. And I was thinking from a visibility perspective, with a twisting, turning track, actually might be slightly better to be in a car where you have a good sight of inside lines, both left and right. Nose to tail then here between Leon Morell and the chasing Joe Locke. And this is the one that stood out for me from qualifying. I mean, you're talking about half a tenth between them, and I think that could be a race-long scrap. But Charles Hall getting the business done into turn one on this first lap.
So that battle for third continues, and going with them is Alistair Smart, who also got himself up a place at the start of the race ahead of Doug Carter. So Alistair Smart, the Class A champion from last year for those tuned engine machines, is there in fifth position ahead of Doug Carter. But their Smart locks up a touch into the hairpin there for the first time. And then they accelerate their way up towards the bus stops to complete the first lap. In qualifying, the pole position time was a 1:23 for Charles Hall, and Scott Mattel trying to go with him at this stage. Remember, Hall's in the slightly smaller engine car, but is lighter than Mattel's that is chasing after him. And then Leon Morell is there in third place, about 3 seconds behind the top two. But even that lap from the rolling start was a 1:25.6, so only a couple of seconds slower than the flying laps in qualifying.
Now, Alistair Smart in fifth, in danger here of becoming a bit too detached from the fight in the BSB category. So that's the one led by Leon Morell, with Joe Locke tucked in behind in that Spire GT3. But the first of the Radical PR6s is drifting away a little bit. I mean, the PR6s will be racing one another, I suppose, as well. But it'd be nice to at least flirt with an overall podium. Alistair Smart just jumping through shot there into the right-hander at Rocket. But third place, still in the hands of the primer grey and green Leon Morell, with Joe Locke for company.
Leon Morell, a 40-year-old carpet shop owner from Nottingham. He was the champion a couple of years ago. Formerly was a radio control car expert. So I'm sure you know somebody that might well know Leon, as they make their way down towards the hairpin. But yeah, he changed to car racing only a few seasons ago and immediately was on the pace, because you wouldn't think there is that much correlation from going from radio control machines to sort of full-size cars. But Leon's been really quick. He's there in third position. He's keeping the what should be a more powerful car of Joe Locke behind. Through turn one goes these top two cars, these cars that have so much downforce, Johnny, so quick through that first corner.
All I'll say about RC cars is look at Lewis Hamilton. You've seen those clips from Blue Peter, haven't you? He was a whiz at about probably 6-7 years old, and hand-eye coordination certainly will play its part. But Scott Mattel turning the wick up a little bit, 0.73 of a second adrift of Charles Hall. So that gap came down at the end of lap 2. Gap's obviously growing to the next duo, because Leon Morell and Joe Locke were not in the same league when it came to qualifying, and Leon Morell, his priority is to try and win Class B. And he should be capable of doing that. The problem is Joe Locke's a massive distraction here, and he will be driving in his mirrors this early on in the race, Josh.
The other problem for Leon Morell is there's only, I think, 3 entries in Class B this weekend, which means maximum points are not for offer within Class B, and the overall champion can come from either class. And currently he's equal on points with Scott Mattel, who, even though he may finish second here to Charles Hall, they'll probably be scoring more points, I think, for having a larger entry. So that's another thing to factor, obviously very early in the championship here, only for the third round of the season. But when you're looking to perhaps win every race within your class to win the overall championship, you need sort of that larger entry to so you can score the points. And Charles Hall's now into the 23, so 1:23.96. And there's Scott Mattel, I think, taking a slightly wider line there into the banked corner, the second turn of the lap, and then up towards Church Corner, which I'd imagine in these cars are probably flat out with all the aero pushing the cars down, and then this larger gap that's heading back to Leon Morell. It looks like Johnny's pulling clear now of Joe Locke in third.
Yeah, he's gapped him, I think is the opportune phrase. The other thing I noticed was Scott Mattel with that wider line into the hairpin at the banking. just started to scrape the front splitter a little bit, and there's a bit too much suspension travel for my liking. It's not a clean and fluid run into the second corner of the banking, and it's important to obviously get a good exit there, because that will determine your speed through the fast right-hander at Church and then up the hill into the braking area for the sequence of corners at Rocket, which is where number 86 has just reached. That's Stephen Bell, running 9th overall in the SR3 RSX, and he has behind him Stephen Larkham in the red and white number 93. That's a PR6, so you can get a feel for the driving position of these two radicals, but not really separated by much lap speed, it appears, 5 minutes into the race.
Yes, Stephen Larkham, who we're looking at there, has come over from Northern Ireland for this weekend. He's only in his second season of racing, having raced in the Irish Road Sports Series in the past. This is a 2009 model of Radical PR6 with a 1340cc Hayabusa engine. From RLM Racing, a self-prepared car for Steve Larkham. There we see Alistair Smart, who's there in 5th position, the 56-year-old from Hampshire, who's been racing for 10 seasons now. Originally in kit car style cars, but more recently in this Radical PR6, and is ahead of Doug Carter, who seemingly has been racing in Bikesports since pretty much the championship begun. And he is there in 6th place. And then Philip Brown isn't that far behind in 7th position. He's the second of the Class B cars in his Radical SR3, I should say, that's there in 7th position overall. Then this battle that Johnny was describing a moment ago between Stephen Bell and Steve Larkham. Again, Stephen Bell's been around the 750 Motor Club for a while. He was a front runner in the RGB Championship in the past. Swapped to Bikesports more recently, and he's in one of the Tim Gray Motorsport prepared machines, just ahead there of Stephen Larkham, the Northern Irishman. So the SR3 there, which you can see is a right-hand drive car. It's not as good down the straights generally, but it's got more aero than the Radical PR6, which is more slippery, but doesn't have the downforce of the more modern Radical SR3. And are they catching Ian Childs, who's there in 8th position? On the last lap they were a few tenths slower, but the gap at the start of the lap was 2.3 seconds. What do you reckon there, Johnny? Is that gap coming down? Yeah,
I think they're possibly working together to reel in Ian Childs. So there's definitely a nice little dice, almost a three-way fight for 8th, 9th and 10th. I'm intrigued by what's happening to Joe Locke, because Joe was able to keep up with Leon Morel for the first 5, maybe 6 minutes, but he's properly dropped away now in 4th position. Number 22, Spire. And then you look further behind Joe, and is Alistair Smart starting to become a bit of a threat? The lap times last time through weren't too far away, but was slightly in favour of Joe Locke. So the danger for him now is he's going to spend the next 12 minutes very lonely indeed in a wayward 4th position. There is time yet, though, to reverse those fortunes and maybe push on again to try and close in on Leon Morel. Gap at the head of the order is still very, very close, though, Josh, I noticed.
Yeah, they did identical lap times on the last lap, 1 minute 24.04. But talking about Joe Locke there, he did finish on the podium overall at Donington Park ahead of Leon Morel. So we can see the spire now of Locke, who did a bit of club enduro racing in the past. He's raced Honda Civics, but he's also raced Bikesports machinery. Joe Locke, who was the third in the championship in 2019 when he was racing a Radical PR6, but has acquired this Spire for this season, and he turns up towards turn 1. He's done a personal best that time, 1 minute 26.6, but still slower than Leon Morel ahead.
Driving standards flag going out to at least one car, possibly more. It's the number
11.
Yeah, it was certainly 2 numbers that were the same.
Yeah, Phil Brown, that would be, if that's the case. So presumably that is for track limits, although I'm not really sure where you can exceed track limits and gain an advantage on the Anglesey circuit.
I don't know, racing drivers will find somewhere. You think it's definitely 11 rather than 77, which obviously would be a bigger story, because we're talking about Charles Hall in that case, the overall race leader. But I think I agree with you, it is 2 1s, so it's Philip Brown running 7th, but 2nd in his class, behind this car, Doug Carter, in the dark blue and orange. Doug's closer to Alistair Smart, I would say, last time I checked, and the lap time, is the best so far that Doug has set for that particular car, 6th place.
Doug Carter was fractionally quicker than Aston Smart in qualifying, but Smart got ahead at the start of the race. The leaders come across the line. That gap looked a little bit less. It was 1.2 seconds after 6 laps, and it's now 0.8 of a second. So for the first time, I think in this race really, the top 2 are separated by less than a second, so we'll catch up on those in a moment, where we watch this radical PR6 battle for 5th position, head up towards the bus stop then again. There's Joe Locke, who I think he's pulling clear of them once more in 4th position. Then those 2 PR6s, those cars which are probably about a decade and a half older now, radical sports cars who are based in Peterborough in Cambridgeshire, but now they've got a base at Donington Park as well. New owners as well to Radical over the last few seasons. But let's have a look at the 2 Mattels, Johnny, leading the race as Scott, the team boss, catching customer Charles Hall.
If you're just joining us, just over halfway through the first race of our broadcast today, so you've not missed much at all, the 750 Motor Club Bikesports Championship, and do not adjust your sets. This really is Anglesey in May, with beautiful wall-to-wall sunshine and a real good stonking scrap at the sharp end. Again, Scott Mittell a little wider, this time into the hairpin, as it's called, rather than the banking. So a wider line, which is what he prefers at the second corner on this track as well. They're going to reach bus stop, the final corner on the international circuit, virtually together. I don't think that's 0.8 of a second anymore. And we'll get a clock on the exact gap in just a tick. It's probably half a second as they work their way onto lap number 8. It's 0.6, so marginally above that. Again, bumping from the front splitter of Scott Mittell's car. And he just drifted the back end out a little bit there as well. That will lose him time. Not a great start to this lap, lap 9, for the second place man, Scott Mittell.
Yeah, well, I wonder if that's where the car's a little bit heavier because it's got a bigger engine. And then up the hill here, Scott Mittell perhaps can just reel in a little bit with, as I say, that slightly bigger, higher booster engine compared to the 1 litre Superbike engine that's in Charles Hall's car that leads the way. Scott Mittell sliding the newer machine around. The car ahead of him, Charles Hall's car, is the car that Scott Mittell was a class champion in back in 2019 when there was a class for the smaller engine cars. Nowadays those cars are included within Class A, but there are so I guess it's a type of balance of performance, the different weights that the cars have to have for the different engine sizes. But yeah, they do take very different lines. And perhaps that's because they are those slightly different cars, different characteristics, Johnny, where perhaps they just need to be driven slightly different.
Well, what it does for Scott is it straightens up the exit of Hairpin onto the straight with no name that runs parallel with Tom Price Straight. In some weekends is actually an additional start-finish straight, but we're using the standard one for both days this weekend. So Scott Mittell, I mean, the car looked on rails through Rocket on the last lap, but then he needed to put in a bit of corrective steering coming out of Peel. So I wouldn't say he's necessarily fighting the car, but he's pushing like crazy to stick with the race leader. And this dice, we trailed ahead because I felt Doug Carter was finding a nice bit of a rhythm. It wasn't a personal best lap time last time around for car number 5, but he is now right on the back of the car ahead, Alistair Smart in the yellow and black.
We noticed that Philip Brown was getting the driving standards flag. He's now getting a 5-second penalty board shown to him, so that will be for exceeding track limits. So that is something actually we'll have to keep an eye on then over the course of the weekend if drivers are going further than the white lines or going further than the curbs, because that is where track limits are picked up on Motorsport UK regulations. And Phil Brown, at this stage, it won't affect his result. He's there he is, a driver in 7th position, because he is further than 5 seconds ahead of the next car. But if he picks up more penalties, that will increase as this battle between the PR6s of Alistair Smart and Doug Carter have come right close together now. Obviously, with these machines, Johnny, they've got quite a bit of downforce, so overtaking not the most easy. Obviously, pretty short braking zones and then a bit of aero wash maybe as well.
Good point. Scott Mittell over the line. Gap this time around is 1.4. It was only a second last time, but it was 0.6 the previous lap, so he's lost 0.4 over the last 2 laps. And is that just how the car is evolving? The second of the Mittell MC41s, but the RR version for Scott Mittell, number 27, trying to stay onto the coattails of Charles Hall, but Hall is the man with the fastest lap, 1:23.96. And to go back to this relatively new MSA rule, that's no wheels over the white line permitted, isn't it?
It's a little bit foggy at the moment, isn't it, between the different series that have slightly different regulations. We haven't got
I know from an international perspective, you have to keep at least one wheel and tyre the correct side of the white line. I thought, though, looking at a car down the start-finish straight, exactly straddling the white line, 50% of the car either side of it. So presumably that's okay.
Yeah, we'll see if that's perhaps where it's actually being picked up. Because I guess that's really coming out of the final corner, isn't it? Up over the curbs, and then when the curb finishes, you're ending up over the white line.
Yeah. But using a bit of the track, just not the track that we're using today. And, there is a white line there, deliberately. So that will be being closely observed. Not the place to do it when you've got 4 race officials on pit wall with a great view of that part of the track, in fairness. Anyway, we will keep an eye on not just this race, but the rest of the day as well. It's got worse, Josh, for the car in question.
Yeah, so perhaps it was that infringement we just saw then. It's now, so you have 5 seconds to start with, and then you add another 10 seconds on for the next penalty. So it's 15 now for Philip Brown, which could well adjust the results. If he does it again, it'll be another 15 seconds. And then if he does it again, it's a drive-through penalty. And then after that, you get excluded. So he might want to pay attention to the flags that our start line marshals are showing to him. But Philip Brown continues in 7th position. For the lead of the race, it's 1.6 seconds between Charles Hall and Scott Mattel. The fastest lap, a 1 minute 23.96 for Charles Hall. And as it will be the case all weekend, that'll be lap records because of the championship not coming to Anglesey International before. A good battle just going across the line, actually, for that was 8th position, wasn't it? Because Steve Larkham has got himself ahead of Stephen Bell, the battle we were watching earlier, and has now closed in on Ian Childs. So a good battle for 8th position going on, as well as the top 2 just spreading out a little bit. Charles Hall just about pulling clear then of Scott Mattel. The 2 drivers have got very different backgrounds, really, because Charles Hall, who, as I said, raced in single-seaters as high as Indy Lights in the States about 15 years ago, then had some time off before returning, where Scott Mattel was a maths school teacher, won the low-cost championship, and then he and his father Ian thought, let's try and start designing cars, and that's what they've done over the last few years, and they've obviously designed some very quick machinery as well.
Back to a scrap we picked out in the opening quarter of the race, really, and it's still the fight for 8th position between Ian Childs and Stephen Larkham, and they're just working their way through the left-hander there at Siemens and onto the Tom Price straight, almost overlapping. The foreshortening of the camera is denying us of the fact that they are absolutely side by side here, and Larkham wide on the entry, tucks back in on the exit, but the next corner is a left-hander at bus stop, so that should favour Ian Charles, depending on how daring Larkham wants to be on the brakes. And I think he does the sensible thing for me, tucks back into line. Oh, big wiggle there as he just got up on the curve. That really unsettled the car, Josh. Yeah, that was quite exciting, wasn't it? Getting a big old slide on in these types of cars. But Steve Larkham not giving up yet. The Irishman all over the back then of Ian Charles, another driver who's been racing in the Bikesports Championship for a very long time. And Larkham's got a good exit out of the banking up towards Church Corner. He has to put the brakes on. He decides the inside line through there. Not the best idea. Charles runs out wide over the curb, so he's got not so much momentum as they head uphill towards Rocket. But I don't think, because of having to put the brakes on into that corner for Steve Larkham, he's not quite able to make that move work with just over a minute on the clock. The lead has crossed the line, though, with a minute and about 45 to go. So 2 laps to go for the leaders, which actually might be about 2.5 laps to go for this battle. Now, as you know, I'm not a racing driver, but that, for me, was a better chance than Stephen Larkham thought, I think. If he'd been a bit more bold and charged his way up the inside of Church Corner, he might have been able to pick off that place. Just catching sight of maybe a half spin on that run through School and on towards Rocket. Side by side again, though, with only 50 seconds to go. Will the outside-inside trick work again for Stephen Larkham, Josh?
Well, again, he's on that outside line. We saw him get a big slide a moment ago as he came out of bus stop. But this time around the outside, he brakes late, and I think that is going to be enough then for what is now 8th position to go the way of Stephen Larkham. And he goes up across the line then with a couple of laps to go. And he is 10 seconds behind Philip Brown. So that battle is actually going to be for 7th position, not unless Brown pulls out another 5 seconds in the final 2 laps.
Yep. Also, very good dice into Rocket, which I'd spotted down effectively the back straight, but it's very curvy for a back straight. And that is Alistair Smart, massively in defensive mode here to Doug Carter, who's been charging all race long. Only 5 seconds left on the clock. And where are the race leader?
Well, Charles Hall has gone through, and Scott Mattel I don't think his car is all that well. That was a very slow lap. You said you thought you saw a half spin a moment ago, so whether that was Scott or whether it was.
I didn't see it, but thankfully we've got another pair of eyes in the booth here. And yeah, Scott Mattel had the moment in second place. The checkered flag was being unfurled there, and I was about to say leaders, but we only had one leader because Charles Hall had gone across the line, as you said, but we are still racing.
Yeah, Mattel is slowing, so I don't think perhaps that spin was caused by a car issue as well. So whether Scott Mattel can get the car home, remember he is the equal championship leader with Leon Morel, and it looks like Leon may well pass him before the end of the race. Although not for a points difference because they're in different classes, but obviously if Scott Mattel can't get the car home, he will lose points, and this was a problem for Charles Hall at Donington Park as well, where he wasn't able to start one of the races. So these more highly tuned cars within Class A can be temperamental at times. So what had been a close battle for the lead, on paper, the result is going to show a very, very large gap for Charles Hall, who turns into the final corner now, and he will be our first race winner at Anglesey on this 750 Motor Club weekend. He wins the 3rd round of the Bikesports Championship by a very long way. But who's going to finish second? Well, Johnny Scott Mattel is kind of back up to speed with Leon Morel behind him. Yeah, into the hairpin, so a couple of corners to go and flinging it around the outside. Leon Morel, he doesn't need to be that daring because the car he's just overtaken is virtually stopped. So Leon Morel into second position. Again, Scott Mattel having to try and do some sort of reset, just to get the car home and on the overall podium. And Leon Morel, I bet, cannot believe his luck. Over the line he goes into second place. This result is going to be so misrepresentative of the race we've actually seen. That's why it's important to witness the race for real. Can Doug Carter make a change of result with 1 corner to go? He's close, isn't he, as he has been for the last couple of laps. Joe Locker's come through in 4th position. So for Scott Mattel, he hasn't actually lost any points in the championship because he's still second in class as well. But for this battle, it is Alistair Smart who fends off Doug Carter. Now for 7th position, Phil Brown, who's only 8 seconds now ahead of Stephen Larkham. So he's not going to finish there in 7th position, even though he comes across the line now on the road. That position for 8th on the road, but what will be for 7th in the results. That will go the way of Stephen Larkham ahead of Ian Childs. And now Stephen Bell, was he a lap down? Because he has not. Oh, here he comes now. So he could have had a chance to take second place in class away from Philip Brown, but this very slow last lap means that's not going to be the case. And he goes across the line now. We lost Mark Boots somewhere through the course of that race, about halfway through. So there's a couple of drivers and teams and cars that are going to have to be refettled ahead of this afternoon's race. The Bikesport's the only category that races on just today's programme. But Leon Morel there, a class winner in 2nd overall. He left big black marks on the road, didn't he, when he got sideways out of the hairpin. But he got that position done. So let's see if we can take a look at the results of the 3rd round of the 750 Motor Club Bikesports Championship, which went the way of Charles Hall in the end by 30 seconds over Leon Morel, who won in Class B. In 3rd position was Scott Mattel after those problems late in the race. 4th went the way of Joe Lock ahead of Alistair Smart and Doug Carter. 7th, provisionally, will now be Stephen Larkham ahead of Ian Childs with Phil Brown down in 9th. And Stephen Bell was the 10th finisher with Mark Boot not making it to the end. So the drivers are heading down towards Parc Fermé now. With better luck, we're here from the top 3 with Andy McEwen, and perhaps we'll find out what happened to Scott Mattel. But he'll be chatting to him with Leon Morel and with Charles Hall. So let's head down to Parc Fermé and to Andy McEwen.
Well, excellent start to our day here at Anglesey. Then we've got the top 3 finishers pulling in behind us with Charles Hall victorious in the first race today. Charles, congratulations, perfect way to start your weekend here at Anglesey. It's a race that wasn't it, because the cars behind were not that far away. You led the whole way, but you can never relax.
No, when you've got Scott behind you, relentless, you know, he just keeps going. But just spoken to him, and I think he had a little issue that just knocked him off. So, yeah, it's good. The car, We're getting used to the car a little bit from Donington, but the car's absolutely awesome. And then so I need to go back in the gym a bit, because you're driving around here, possibly that has been one of my favourite drives I've had, just because the track's mega, the car was working, and it just felt brilliant, yeah.
What are track conditions like out there? Obviously dry, but the temperature climbing, and this place can get a bit slick, can't it?
It was just going off towards the end a little bit, so yeah, just learned something on the first time we've run on the Pirellis, and they are like brilliant. So yeah, I think I just probably a little bit on the pressures, because as it got to the end, if I was still having to push him, I think I was going to, they were going to go greasy, yeah.
Thoughts now for the rest of the weekend? Same again, obviously, is the plan, but it ain't going to be easy, is it?
No, I know. I've got one under the belt, so yeah, we've got to keep my head down.
Sounds like a plan. Charles Hall then victorious in our first race. Now, where's Leon Morel got to? He is behind me. Try not to fall over the ball. That was a good start to the day, wasn't it? Leon is having a quick chat with the scrutineer. Sorry, can I just jump in for a second? Leon, congratulations. Second place there. Looked like being a podium from the start, but got to be happy that it became P2.
Yeah, I mean, obviously ultimately we're racing, so you see anyone in front of you, I'm desperate to catch him, but I was also conscious that Scott is not even in my class, so I didn't want to do anything stupid, and I could see his car was doing some at random corner exit, so we came into entrance to the corkscrew, let's call it, I don't know what the corner's called. I thought about sending it on the brakes then, but I thought if it cuts mid-corner, I'm just going to run into the back of him. So as we came down the back straight, I was mindful that he'd covered the inside, so I went deep and went for the switchback, and luckily, well, not luckily, but his car cut out on the middle of the apex. So yeah, it was good. A bit out of breath, hot, super hot, but yeah, no, that was good. I really enjoyed it. Pushing from the start, flat out. Car didn't go off, so can't ask for more than that, really. Shout out to my mum. She's watching at home, so sorry you couldn't beat her mum, but next time.
Excellent stuff. Congratulations, Leon, on that second place. And Scott Mattel, third place finish for him on the podium, but must be a little bit disappointed with that. Quick word with you, Scott. What exactly was the problem?
I'm not totally sure, but I kept having to cycle it on the master switch. So I think there's probably a block in a fuel filter or something like that, and the ECU's too clever for its own good. So if it sees something below low fuel pressure, it thinks something's broken, so it turns itself off. So I was just having to sort of turn it back on and off every time.